All right. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who helped to bring me here and the other speakers today. It's a thrill to come across the world to see everyone here today. I've never been to Porto and I'm super struck by it. And foolishly, I didn't bring a surfboard. I did bring a wetsuit. Try and make it work somehow. Okay. Bear with me occasionally when I have a look at this thing. Yeah, I should introduce myself properly. My name is Nick Carroll. I'm a surfer from the northern beaches of Sydney in Australia. I've been surfing for a very long time, and I've been watching and observing surfing for almost as long. Partly this is because I don't really know how to do it yet. It sounds a bit funny, but I'm sure anyone who's been surfing a long time will have had the experience of having to reinvent the sport for themselves in some way in order for it to become fresh, and there's many ways of doing that. So what I thought it would be nice to talk about today is, you know, probably the biggest reinvention of surfing in my lifetime, and maybe ever. And I don't know. You know, the biggest thing that happened in surfing had nothing to do with surfing, okay? Absolutely nothing. I don't know what you remember of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, where you were at the time. I can tell you where I was. Of course, I live on the Australian East Coast. We were finally beginning to recover from the worst bushfires along the east coast of Australia since European colonisation 230 years ago. And what had happened at the end of those bushfires was this incredible series of rainstorms hit the coast. So 6 months of just complete dryness, no rain whatsoever, and the whole country enveloped in a pall of smoke, just like I understand Portugal has been over the last couple of weeks. Was blown away by this incredible series of storms, and it was the beginning of a La Nina climate cycle, and the Australian East Coast is completely dependent on the Pacific Ocean's big climate cycles of El Nino and La Nina. They just turn the page over and over again, and La Nina brings surf to the Australian East Coast. And in the years of the pandemic and into the year or so afterwards, La Nina brought the best surf of my life to my coast. It was insane. But, you know, that was great, but I wasn't really the important one, right? You know, the last pandemic before this one was the Spanish flu pandemic of 1919. Nobody really remembers that pandemic too well, partly because it's passed beyond living memory now, and partly because nobody wrote anything about it at the time, because the world was trying to get over World War I. And the idea that the Spanish flu was about to kill 6% of the world's population really wasn't on anyone's radar, right? We just wanted to forget about it and move on. So nothing in our minds, in our young minds, prepared us for what was about to happen in March 2020. You know, 6 months in to that pandemic, while the whole world was fully still panicking about everything to do with COVID-19, not sure what to think, not sure what to do about it, not sure what the results were going to be of this thing, it was growing really clear that we were seeing the biggest single influx of surfers in the sport's history. Between June 2020 and June 2021, just in Australia alone, nearly 200,000 people took up surfing. 68% of them were women. This astonishing increase was mirrored worldwide, especially in the big, wealthy Western countries. In the years of the pandemic, the globe's active surf population, and by active I mean committed surfers, people who actually go surfing and don't talk about it, just, it's thought to have increased by around 20%, from a little under 6 million to about 7.5 million active participants in surfing. By the way, you'll have heard a lot of nonsense about how many people surf in the world, okay? It's usually promulgated by people who have something to gain from inflating the figures. I'm fortunate enough to work with Surfline, the global surf forecasting and content site, and we do a lot of research, and we get to see how, I guess, populations flex and change in surfing around the world. So I'm pretty confident in that figure of about a 20% increase. It's still colossal, right? 1.5 million people began to surf. And, you know, again, a majority of these people were women, and they were mostly in the wealthy Western democracies. There wasn't really a shadow boom amongst the surf populations of third world countries, most of which suffered far worse financially than the wealthy West. And we'll get into reasons for that a bit later. So, let's see. Let's move on a little bit. It was so unexpected, this boom, the numbers of people who flooded into the water. Places that already had a lot of people surfing had just a few more. Places that were not surfed very much suddenly had a lot more people. But one of the really marked things about the boom was that it was particularly local. This was because the pandemic put a blocker on all kinds of surf travel and tourism for most of us. Many of us weren't able to leave the country where we lived, and those of us who could found us very much blocked by what happened when you tried to get into another country, even if they'd let you in. So this was a peculiarly localised boom, which I think was really unusual as well, because that has not happened for many, many years. Travel has been a part of the surfing experience for, 50 years or so at least, ever since the endless summer came across our screens. So this unexpected boom was really, really localised. Let's try and go. So everything that happened was really, really counterintuitive. It was as counterintuitive as expecting that because of the pandemic there'd be a surge in surf numbers, the likes of which we'd never seen before. One of the hilarious things about it was its effect on the surfboard industry. Now, I don't know how many people in the audience are part of the surfboard industry. I know you've for sure all gone and bought surfboards, maybe custom boards from people you know, all that stuff. If you have, then you know that the surfboard industry was sure it was doomed at this time. The surfboard industry is perpetually sure that it's doomed, right? Like most surfboard makers sit around the factory, quite a bit, just going, oh my God, things are going to fall off the perch here and I won't be able to employ anyone in a month because nobody's buying surfboards. Instead, the surfboard industry through this period was overwhelmed. It's funny, I look back at a lot of the reporting I did around April 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning to take effect. And it was amazing the level of sort of fatalism amongst the board makers about what was about to happen, right? Darren Handley of DHD in Australia on the Gold Coast there, one of the world's biggest board makers, he lost the majority of his stock orders pretty much overnight. Like, surf shops just called everyone who'd ordered boards, just called him up and said, we don't want those boards anymore, sorry. His business fell by like 70% in a month. The business was saved by an Australian government support program. I know this sounds particular to Australia, but it did happen all over the world in different ways, okay? The support program channeled cash of up to $1,500 a week in employee support for any business who'd suffered more than a 20% downturn in revenue, okay? So the idea was that you channeled the money through businesses so they wouldn't lay people off just because they weren't selling surfboards anymore. And it would mean that people would remain committed to their jobs until the pandemic kind of receded. Sort of smart thinking, but whatever. What actually happened was that this just fueled the growth of the surfboard market beyond belief. Like, one way to really kickstart the surfboard market, we now know, is to lay everyone off, but just keep paying them, right? So suddenly they had all this time in their hands, and yet the same money that they would have had if they'd kept working. boom, out you go. Like surfboard sales soared to unprecedented heights. Supply chain failures associated with the pandemic meant that, like, the central manufacturing and distribution models adopted by most of the world's biggest board makers, people like GSI, to an extent Firewire, a bunch of other big producers who work out of Thailand and China and Vietnam and send boards all around the world, right? Their business models were temporarily crippled by the pandemic because shipping just fell apart too, right? So this chucked the bulk of the board making work back on local board makers. And so now they were complaining about having too much work, right? Like this was the new doomed. Oh no, I'm doomed because I'm having to make too many boards. What they did find was that there wasn't enough of anything. There weren't enough glass shops to do the work. There wasn't enough like chemicals being brought into the country to make enough blanks to fill demand. There weren't enough skilled workers because, surfboard makers don't train very many workers, for a couple of reasons. One, because it costs a lot of money, and two, because they're afraid of training people who are going to compete with them down the track, right? So there wasn't enough of anything except customers. What a position to be in. The wetsuit makers found themselves in really similar territory, and they were better equipped to deal with it. Rip Curl and O'Neill saw wetsuit sales spike in concert with surfboard sales, like close to 100%, right? That's what we're talking about, like a doubling of the market. Anyone making anything to do with actual surfing, this was the key, right? The fashion side of surfing fell apart at the same time for a bunch of different reasons. But anyone who was making something to do with actually going surfing, a surfboard, a wetsuit, a leash, tail pads, things like that, they all got this sugar hit of huge proportions. Yeah, come on. I do. Oh, let's go back. Okay. Unexpectedly, other things just fell apart completely in surfing. Like, professional surfing just ceased to exist. It just stopped. This guaranteed thing that had been thudding away in surf culture for, well over 40 years in various forms, suddenly just stopped happening. Like the press releases, I kept them, most of them, and the press releases delaying the start of the championship tour in 2020, they're unintentionally hilarious reading today. Like, they started out, like it's like the board makers in reverse. They started out really optimistic, like, oh, don't worry, we're just going to put it off for a couple of months and everything's going to be okay. And then, oh, no, well, we won't be holding the Bells Beach contest but we'll wait till June, we'll be up and running again, it. And then came June and they're just like these solemn press releases came out like, oh, well, I'm sorry, but we're just going to abandon the championship tour for 2020. There won't be any world champions. And everyone was like, oh, really? Oh, okay. There were bigger things to worry about. Plus, we all had these new surfboards. We had to go surfing, right? Like, that sort of mattered more at the time. I know, the same thing happened to all organised surfing, basically. Right down to the simple community layer of surfboard riding clubs. At least in Australia, you're allowed to go surfing, by the way, but you weren't allowed to do it in groups. Like, you couldn't come down the beach with 30 of your buddies and set up a surf contest and have a surf contest on a Sunday. So the whole board riders club movement fell apart for a while too. They had to postpone the first surfing Olympics for a year, along with the whole of the rest of the Olympics, by the way. The surf industry had already been really splintered by the global financial crisis 10 years earlier, and the pandemic pretty much stabbed it to death, right? Like, it was brutal. Like, companies were still laying off a lot of people early this year as a result of the effects of the pandemic on what you might call the surf fashion industry. A lot of them had already done a bit of rationalising, but their sales compared to the beginning of this century, It just dwindled to almost nothing by comparison. They were still functioning businesses, but that's about all you could say for them, really. Their ability to affect the surf culture had pretty much ceased. So aside from surfboard wetsuits and leg ropes, the pandemic was a real industry killer. Travel totally fell to bits. Many surfers who'd grown used to their annual trips to Indonesia or the Maldives, for instance, found themselves stuck at home trying to figure out their slightly more crowded lineups. The collapse of surf tourism was tied to the, crushing of grommet surfing dreams in many third world countries. Okay, if you go to Indonesia on surf trips, you'll see nowadays quite a few groms learning how to surf on boards that were left there or sold to them by travelling surfers. That's been a thing for 15 years or so now. In the pandemic, that whole thing stopped. A lot of those grommets' families lost their living totally, and they were not supported to the tune of $1,500 a week by friendly governments who were cashed up and could borrow like $100 billion on the spur of the moment to support their populations, right? These are countries with no backup, no reserves, or at least none they were going to waste on just workers, So, without a flood of that Western tourism money pouring into Central America, Indonesia and Africa, coastal economies really suffered. We'll never know the toll this actually took, by the way. We really won't. Most of the Balinese families, for instance, whose livelihoods were destroyed in the process, they have no voice here. No one is speaking for them, and no one really ever will. So we really won't know what happened to a lot of those people. It was hard, for sure, though. Surf schools weren't allowed to operate either, and this gave all those newly stoked surfers an unbelievably fantastic opportunity, right? They could begin to surf as people have always begun to surf. They could go down to the beach with a couple of their friends and find a wave and just go out and surf. And I surfed with a lot of these people over the year and a half or 2 years of when the whole thing was operating. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But, come on, talk to me. New things arose, though. Like, you never get a clearing out like the pandemic caused in surf culture without things arising to take their place, right? So, the primary surf star driver in the world for many years was pro surfing. That went away. And suddenly it kind of opened up things, opportunities for different kinds of surf stars to find their feet. I think, like, in the context of this, I think of Torren Martin here. You might have heard of Torren. He's a beautiful surfer, and him and his mate Ishka Folkwell had been travelling around the world just making little surf movies and never quite catching fire with them, but it was all about like a couple of friends going surfing. And then suddenly they started preparing this movie that they wanted to make about trying to get from Scotland to Morocco to get a swell, right? And they did this just before the pandemic started. But they didn't finish the movie until early 2021 because it's harder than it looks to make surf movies, turns out. Anyway, that movie came out then in early 2021 and it just took off. Insanely popular. Suddenly it was like 1 million views on YouTube, all that stuff. And Torren, who had actually quietened his surfing down in these movies because he's a really skilled surfer. When he was younger, he was a full-on competitor. He can surf a shortboard like anyone, like airs, whatever, okay? Instead, he quietened his surfing down. He was just riding a long twin fin in these movies and just drawing simple lines, really simple lines that anyone could identify with and living a really simple life on the road, meeting a few people in the locations, and never really imposing himself on situations or trying to be a surf star. It was a recipe made in heaven, especially amongst all the surfers who'd begun to surf, and just they would never have been ready to face the full glare of professional surfing turned up on them as an image of what they might be like in surfing. Like, who can really relate, right? Like, you can't relate to those skills, but you can relate to someone like Torrin, who's just cruising along, trimming, having a really good time with his friend on a trip. Like, and that's what everyone wanted to do anyway. Down the track, it led to a bunch of other people, like Nathan Florence, right? Like, it's allowed Nathan to build a whole surf media entrepreneur business based on his own travels and trying to ride giant waves and usually succeeding. You could say the same thing for surf companies. The pandemic popped open doors for at least a dozen new mini wetsuit makers. You know, Torrin's sponsor, Need Essentials, right? They sell wetsuits for like $300 a steamer. There's no sticker on them. There's nothing. Their only marketing spend is on Torrin's movies. That's it, right? You know, there's a bunch of other wetsuit makers like that who've just like been able to manage everything out because they tapped into supply chains that they didn't need a whole lot from. They were able to survive it and get through it and prosper as well. A couple of wave pools turned the pandemic into that rarest thing in the wave pool industry, profitable businesses. There's look, I apologise to anyone who's a wave pool addict here, but like, out of everything in surfing, wave pools are probably the most overspoken thing, given their effect on surf culture, really, right? There's not even a half a dozen functioning, publicly available wave pools in the whole world right now. There's like 100 planned, but they cost $50 million each. Going to take a little while. Meanwhile, they're just on Surfline alone. There's 11,000 spots around the world being forecast every single day. And that's a fraction of the number of the world's surf spots. So there's lots of people not surfing in wave pools, I guess. That's a problem for wave pools, but some of them solved it during the pandemic. One in particular is Urban Surf's Wave Garden Pool in Melbourne, in Australia. They were fortunate because of one thing, they had a captive audience. People who were stuck in Melbourne for a long time weren't allowed to travel more than a few kilometres away from their homes. So trying to go surfing at Bells Beach, which is about 80 or 100 kilometres down the street from Melbourne, was impossible. However, the wave pool was right there. Okay, so you could go there and get your hit. You could get something out of surfing. Another one was the pool in Waco, Texas. There were less restrictions on travel in the US than there were in Australia or in Europe for that matter. And so people started travelling at the wave pool to fill their boots a little bit. The surf was no good in the US for a lot of this period. La Nina was in operation, right? That's when Australia gets good and the US West Coast kind of bogs. So they kind of worked out. Wave pools started working out. But what really blew up and what have continued to blow up in the background of surfing right now is surf retreats. So these are really particular kind of business. They're kind of tourism replacement businesses, okay? And they usually involve like a well-known surfer, like a surf star, you know, like my little brother Tom. He does these retreats too with other people. But he doesn't actually do anything, by the way. The surf star doesn't do anything at these retreats. They just show up and like spread the love, you know. Well, there's a few people in the background doing all the hard work, right? And the retreats involve usually a dozen or a few more people, often who are willing to spend a lot of money, like $1,000 a day is quite common. And you show up and you'll walk through the surfing experience from this very kind of, I don't know, wellness perspective usually, right? Like it's holistic. You know, you get to go there and maybe you meditate with my little brother and then maybe you go surfing with someone else and maybe someone shows up and talks to you about nutrition and maybe someone else shows up and talks to you a little bit about the ocean or something, maybe a little bit about environmentalism, and then you go surfing again. And the whole thing evolves over several days and everyone goes home super happy and stoked and $5,000 poorer, right? And these businesses are really starting to kind of rev up now that tourism's back on the agenda. You know, you'll find them happening everywhere. The Mentawai is littered with surf retreats now on boats and in camps. And a lot of these I would almost say 68% of them, to correlate with the number of women who came into surfing during the pandemic, are really woman-focused, right? They're usually women only, in fact, and they work really brilliantly because a lot of the women who began to surf during the pandemic, and by the way, generations of women before them, have found the lineup to be an extraordinarily intimidating place, right? Because there were people like me 30 years ago, right? Like hungry for waves, just paddling all over the place and just stealing everyone's waves. And like there was no way a woman who was beginning to surf, would walk into that and go, well, this is fun. I'm really enjoying this. There's this guy paddling around me, snarling at me all the time. When there's 10 of me, holy crap. Anyway, a retreat provides a really safe place for you to begin to learn more about surfing and to begin making surfing your own, because that's a really important thing in surfing, right? You have to be able to make it your own in some way. Anyway, surf retreats, full-on pandemic boom businesses. But in the water, right? Like, I always think, when I think of surf culture, I always think, well, it always starts there, right? Like when you're paddling around out the back, you're catching a few waves and you're talking to people or not talking to people, as we do, and we're stealing each other's boards or whatever we get up to while we're surfing, right? That's where surf culture begins, right? And there was what I felt was a small but really significant change in the way that surf crowds worked thanks to the pandemic, and it happened during the pandemic, and it's continued after that. There were more people surfing, and yet somehow it was less of a hassle than it had ever been. I was super lucky during the pandemic in a number of ways, but one way in which I was really lucky was I made a really great new friend, a woman called Hannah Anderson. She was the first person I hired at Surfline in Australia to help me run that site. And I knew her family, the famous, well, not that famous, obviously not everyone's going to know them, but the famous Bondi Anderson family. And that gave me a lot of confidence in hiring her. And it gave me a lot of confidence in Hannah generally, and holy shit, she's really good. She now runs Editorial for all of Surfline Asia Pacific, which is, I think, probably the most powerful position a woman's ever held in surf media. But that's not the basis of our friendship. We're just super simpatico. We just know what the other one is thinking all the time. We also pretty much do things that allow us to go surfing as much as possible, right? And so that means we surf a lot together, because the excuse is work, and we're working together. So it's like, oh yeah, we'll go here because we've got to take some photos and talk to some people. So we'll just go there and surf anyway. And so while the pandemic was sort of thrashing around in the background and slowly kind of beginning to die off in its effects, we surfed everywhere we could. We surfed the whole east coast of Australia, from a spot called Blacknose in Portland in Victoria, which is way west of Bells Beach, all the way up to Agnes Water in central Queensland, which you've probably never heard of, right? It's a really cool little point break that only breaks when there's a lot of trade wind out in the Pacific. But it's super fun. And we went to Fiji, we surfed in Indonesia, Hawaii, California, and everywhere we went, we sensed this small but significant shift in lineup mood. It's kind of a cliche to say that women's presence in the water has changed lineups' moods. I think it's not quite the way it appears, right? I think it's more that now there are just so many different kinds of surfers on so many different crafts, so many different ages, 2 genders, maybe more, right? And the pandemic also might have left a lot of us with the sense that, like, maybe we should give each other a break. Like, the world's a hard place. It's really weird. I don't like this. Like, maybe we should go easy on each other. Like, we can share this situation. And so I go somewhere like Curl in Sydney, which is a super crowded beach break and was dominated for years by a pack of people like me when I was 30 years old, right? Like gnarly people, like I was talking about, hasslers. And now you can paddle out there and there'll be 50 people out and everyone's somehow sharing it, right? They're not necessarily hooting each other all the time, but, you know, if someone wants a wave, they'll get a wave. It's not hostile the way it used to. There's less male aggression and there's more awareness of each other, whatever that means. I like this shot. It really represents, I'll just go back to that for a sec. It really represents it. I know Julio said, oh, I don't really like the description of surfing as just fun, okay? And I sympathise with that point of view, but I also think it is really fun. And the fun in it connects us, right? And so here we've got a couple of women surfing the pass in Byron Bay, different ages and different skill levels, actually. But they don't care. They're dropping in on each other. They've sort of broken the mould of what surfing used to look like, right? And this is a real thing about the pandemic. It just broke moulds right across the board. And it lets people like this just surf next to Dave Rastovich or whatever, you know, whoever we think is a surf star at the time. Look at him, old Baldy, in the barrel. Oh, gosh. I sometimes wonder if the pandemic was a Kelly career killer. Like, it probably robbed him of a last shot at a world title, right? You know, not that we can get too worried about Kelly's world titles, like he's got enough of them. But he's riding wave here at Kandui Lefts in the Mentawai, and it was the first great swell to hit post-pandemic travel relief, right? It was June 2022, and this was a real epic season starter of a swell, and it just bombed Kandui. You might remember some of the photos and video that came out of that. And Kelly was a part of that, like he's a part of pretty much everything in surfing. But just as Kelly's career has switched in the years since the pandemic, and he's trying very hard to become a kind of surfing elder now, right? Like a coach or a... I can't see it myself, but he's having a shot at it, right? The received wisdom that Kelly Slater was always going to be a shot for a world title, which had been with us for like 30-something years, had fallen apart. And the same thing tore apart, the pandemic tore apart a lot of received wisdom in surf culture, okay? Just took it apart. Particularly, I think, about why people actually start surfing. There's a real weird cognitive dissonance that happens with us as surfers. You've got to follow me on this one, right? We all start surfing, right? And then at some point, usually about 3 years into it, we start getting judgmental about who else gets to start surfing. Ignoring why we did it in the first place. Okay? That ownership of surfing I talked about before suddenly becomes a literal ownership where we think we're allowed to put like barriers somehow on entry into the sport because we started it and now we think it's ours and you can't have it. It's all very well to laugh at it. We are all guilty of this, right? Every one of us. And this cognitive slip, because it really is, a lack of recognition of why you started surfing leads to you not tolerating other people starting surfing. That is a cognitive slip. Something's missed in the equation, right? And it's led to some really, really grand judgments. You know, about many aspects of surf culture and their supposed evils. Like, why are other people in the water? It must be professional surfing's fault, right? Professional surfing's often been blamed for increases in numbers in the water. The surf industry has been blamed for it. Oh, they talk about surfing all the time. They're just like, and that means other people are starting to surf. It's all their fault. The crowds and my attention and my waning older person skills are all the fault of the surf industry who are encouraging other people to get in the water with me. Terrible. The surf media, far out. We're definitely to blame for people getting into surfing. Like, for sure, there is no doubt that the surf media is to blame for everything generally, but that in particular. It's all someone else's fault. But the pandemic surf boom occurred like, I'm sorry, but the pandemic surf boom occurred at a time that professional surfing literally ceased to exist. The surf industry, the surf media, they were at their lowest ebb in memory, I would say, maybe till 1975. I guess that's a pretty long time, so, you know. Like, yet, with no apparent trigger, 1.5 million people had decided to go surfing. What could possibly be the cause of this? Could it be that people start surfing because they want to? Because it's insanely fun, because they have the chance. The pandemic, more than anything, slowed down a busy world. Made us sit in a place and go, whoa, I've got a bit of time now. What do I do? You know, people are still paying me to do nothing. What do I do with that money? Right? And most of all, like, what can I do that I've always wanted to do? Like, it gave a lot of overworked humans a shot at doing the thing they'd been dreaming of for a long time, right? And it also ended up crystallising a lot of trends in surfing that had been brewing steadily for many years. It dragged the sport into the presence in a way, you know? It was like surfing was sort of a little bit lagging prior to the pandemic. It was still hung up on a lot of myths and thoughts about surfing that we'd held for a long time, and we were kind of stuck in them a little bit. And the pandemic kind of broke that up. The surf industry is no longer dominated by a handful of players, but instead has been kind of rearranged so that, you know, fashion labels are a lot smaller and a lot more varied and cater to a lot of different people. And the hard goods makers have come out of it in a much stronger position. The balance feels a lot more right there, right? Surfboard makers should be strong. You know, they should do well. Hard good makers should be successful. It helps them make better stuff for us. If there's an overemphasis on fashion in the surf industry, all that gets left behind, which is kind of a bummer, right? You know, pro surfing seized the moment to reinvent itself with a new world title format and a bunch of other simplifying changes, a process which it's still engaged in. Do not be surprised if you see the championship tour gender numbers equalise in 2025. You're probably going to see similar numbers for men and women. And, you know, who could say that women, as they might have said 50 years ago, can't surf? That's kind of ridiculous, right? Like, there's easily enough women to make an incredibly competitive championship tour at the same level as the men right now. And, you know, there's a few lessons that came out of this, I think. Come on, Kelly, go away. That's it. Tomorrow. Like, one of the big lessons was that, like, it's super cool to go surfing more, right? The more time you can spend hunting that thing, the better for your, you know, mental and physical health. And for those people who have to live with your habit, right? It's very good for you to surf a lot. But I think the biggest lesson of the pandemic is you can't see the big things coming. You just can't. You know, the smaller things are always there, and they'll come in and reassert themselves, just the way elite professional surfing is sort of slowly reasserting itself. And, you know, lots of businesses in surfing managed to survive, and they moved on. A lot of the travel companies who are running businesses in Indonesia, for instance, don't use travel agents anymore. They can deal with their own business their own way. They've learned to manage that, and if they survive the pandemic with no customers at all for a year, then you know they know how to run a business, right? Like, you don't get through that by accident. So a lot of those companies are now running really slick businesses, and they're doing quite well, even though this year they took a bit of a hit because there's a lot of financial pressure on a lot of families right now because of interest rates going up, right? I don't know, maybe over time, though, that travel blow-up will help drive regrowth in the countries themselves and make up some of the losses that the locals experienced during the pandemic. And maybe in 10 years as a result of that, you're going to see a whole new crop of really crazy, super skilled grommets coming out of places like Indo and Central America. Not that you aren't seeing a few now, but like, whoa, maybe they're the new Brazil. Julio, you never know. But another really, really big thing was that increase in women's numbers. Like, that's the biggest thing I've seen happen in my surfing life, for sure, is the move toward not gender equivalence, right, but a balance of numbers that are a bit more reflective of the number of people in the world and where we're at with men and women. I think men are about 49.1% of the world's population right now, and women are a little bit under 51% of the world's population. You know, surfing's not there yet. It's about 38-62 right now. Okay, so, but we moved a bit, like a long way, right? And that is making lineups better. It is making the sport more well-rounded. It is making, I don't know, there's a lot more surfing families now than there's ever been. You know, people surf together a lot more as a result of that. It's really kind of beautiful, I think, and it's been a long time coming. That was really great. But, like, the other really big thing, aside from the amazing revelation of why actually people go surfing, right, that's now undeniable. You cannot blame pro surfing for the number of people in the water. Sorry, it doesn't work. You can't blame the surf industry. You can't even blame the surf media anymore. It's just, they're out there with you because they want the same thing as you do. And if you're in a crowd, you're part of the crowd. It's not you and the crowd. You're the crowd. Can't get away from that now. But the biggest thing aside from all that is that it's really clear now that surfing is not immune to the world at large. Like, one of the great myths of surfing until very recently was that it was somehow special and removed from the rest of the world. That when you stepped into surfing, you stepped into this odd, trippy world that no one else could inhabit, right? Like, only a surfer knows the feeling. There's some truth to that. I'm not saying there's no truth to that, but it's not what we really think is going on there with surfing, I think. I'll just give you some examples. Here's a few other things that boomed in the pandemic. Cycling. We don't think of cycling as being like surfing, do we? Swimming, especially ocean swimming, what they call wild swimming in England. I don't know why they think it's wild. They're swimming like ponds. But like a friend of mine said, it's not wild swimming unless there's sharks. Tennis boomed during the pandemic. Who would have known? Rock climbing, super boomed in the pandemic. Skating, boomed during the pandemic. You know, so surf culture is special, don't get me wrong, but we are not operating away from the rest of the world. We're literally entangled in the world as it is and as it's always been. And that's a really good thing to remember as we head into the future. Because maybe it'll give us a little bit more insight into surfing and why we do it. Like, what are we looking for? It's the same thing a lot of other people are looking for in a lot of different places. And, you know, I suspect that's surfing's best kind of like nurturing force, the thing that will carry it into the future, is that it is something people want to do. It is something people we don't know want to do. And if there's ever another pandemic, there'll be another 1.5 million surfers. Just dive in and start surfing. Anyway, that's all I've really got to say about this. Maybe there's some questions. Anyone got any questions?